President, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on the Senate floor right now. So we just had a nomination for the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We're trying to move him along. Really important job. And it's taken some time. Matter of fact, it's taken a long time, Mr. President, as you know, to get nominees from the White House confirmed by this body to run the government. To run the government. Pretty important job to run the government. We not only need cabinet secretaries, which, by the way, took months for this body to confirm. They slowed down the confirmation of the White House's choices to run the federal agencies. No real explanation why. And now, undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, federal judges. Delay. We're supposed to be trying to put people in place to run the government. But, Mr. President, it's taken a real long time to do this, which is the job of the U.S. Senate. And it shouldn't be this way. Shouldn't be this way. You look at U.S. history, typically enabling a president to fill the key positions of government has not been a partisan issue. An election happens, yeah, there can be some debates on cabinet officials, but you typically want to fill the government and start running the government on behalf of the American people. It's not been a partisan issue in America. Well, unfortunately, it's becoming a partisan issue due to what, by any measure, is historic obstruction on the nominations from the White House to run the federal government. Historic obstruction. Mr. President, the people did elect us here, and they elected a new president, and implicit in the election was that they wanted us to get to work, to do things that, in my view, are very bipartisan. What are some of those things? Grow the economy. We haven't had 3% GDP growth in almost 15 years. That's a bipartisan issue, growing the economy. Rebuilding our military, unleashing energy that we have in this great nation in enormous abundance. Investing in infrastructure, streamlining regulations that are strangling small businesses, and yes, enacting policies to address the spiraling costs of health insurance and health care across the country. And throughout history, the party in the minority understood this after an election and would vote on, confirm new members of an administration. Not just cabinet secretaries, but undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, judges. In fact, the current minority leader said the following in 2013, quote, "Who in America doesn't think a president, Democrat or Republican, deserves his or her picks for who should run the agencies? Nobody," unquote. Nobody. Well, those are wise words in 2013. I just wish he would remember them in 2017, because apparently he's forgotten those words. He's forgotten those words. Because right now, it's just pure obstruction in terms of trying to seat the people to run the government. So, Mr. President, sometimes it's important to explain a little bit, try to explain to the American people what's going on the Senate floor, because it can be confusing. I still get confused sometimes. Arcane rules. But let's just give an example of what just happened here right now. We had the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the number 2 official at the Department of Defense. Pretty darn important job. We voted, after he came out of committee, Armed Services Committee, on which I sit, to end debate on his nomination. The vote just happened. I think it was 90-6, I believe. So very bipartisan. Very bipartisan. And by the way, we need people at the Department of Defense, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, regardless of who you voted for in the November elections. Most Americans want us to have good people running the Department of Defense right now. We have very few there, very few because of this obstruction. So the Deputy Secretary, the cloture vote just happened, 90-6. So that's very strong bipartisan. In previous times, Democrat or Republican administration, the Senate would normally say, hey, let's move him. He needs to get over there. Let's unanimously agree to moving that nomination more quickly so he can help run the Department of Defense. Pretty important job. Well, unfortunately, we're not in that era right now. So what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been doing for every single nomination for this administration is now we will have an additional 2-day waiting period, an additional 30 hours of debate. Those are Senate rules. But normally on someone this non-controversial, those get waived. Those get waived. But we have a minority leader who wants to drag out every single official in the new administration from being seated. Really hasn't explained why. I haven't heard an explanation why. But it's happening. Every single official. 3 to 4 days on one official. Someone did an estimation. If they keep this up, all the Senate-confirmed jobs, they do it for every single Senate-confirmed jobs. It'll take 11 years. 11 years to seat the officials in the Trump administration. Now, how is that helping the American people? How is that helping the American people? It's not. And yet, nobody comes down here and explains why they're doing it. The press doesn't report on it. So, let me just give you some other facts on that, Mr. President. So normally when you waive these rules, you can have a voice vote. Non-controversial nomination like the Deputy Secretary of Defense we just had, normally that would be voice voted. In fact, at this point in President Obama's presidency, so the first 6 months of his presidency, the Senate allowed more than 90% of his nominees to be confirmed by simple voice vote. In fact, the Senate only asked for procedural votes 8 times on 8 nominees. That was it. First 6 months of President Obama's administration. That was actually normal. That was normal. Democrats or Republicans would do something along those lines. For the Trump administration, first 6 months, the minority leader and his colleagues have demanded cloture votes for every single nominee, no matter what the position, no matter how non-controversial, no matter how bipartisan. The courtesy extended to President Obama to get his team together so he could run the country has not been extended here. That's just a fact. Let me give you another fact, Mr. President. According to the Nonpartisan Partnership for Public Service, at about this point in President Obama's first term, he had 183 of his nominations confirmed. 183. Getting people in their positions in government to run the country. Doesn't matter what party you're in, to run the country. But while President Trump's administration has made 178 nominations up to this point to the Senate, only 46 have been confirmed. So, President Obama at this point, 183 nominations confirmed. This president, 46. Historic obstruction. But nobody comes down here and says, why? Why are you doing this? What's the point? What's the point? This isn't by accident. This isn't by accident. The head of a leading Democratic think tank told the press recently they intended to hold up, delay, tie up floor time for every single nomination for a Senate-confirmed position. But what they don't do is they don't go, well, and here's why. Here's why we want to do that. Why do they want to do that? It's not going to help us grow the economy. It's not going to help us with infrastructure. It's not going to help us rebuild our military when you keep the deputy secretary from coming into his position. Just last week, we had a judge who was nominated from the state of Idaho, district court judge, who was confirmed unanimously, and it almost took the entire week to get him confirmed on the Senate floor because the minority leader was delaying. Even somebody who got 100% of the senators to vote for him. So again, it's not clear why they're doing this. Some of the other non-controversial nominees that are being delayed, the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, 2 nominees to review pipelines and other projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You think we need that for our country to grow the economy? We do. These are important positions to do the work of the federal government. And yet, it's all delay. And nobody in the press even asks any questions. Historic obstruction right now, and nobody's even asking, why are you doing it? It would be great to have the minority leader come down the Senate floor and just tell us why. I want to know why. I want to grow the economy. We need these people in positions of authority to help us do the things, bipartisan things, that the American people sent us here to do. Not delay, not obstruct. So, Mr. President, something else that's happening on the Senate floor right now, it's not just nominees, historic obstruction. The other side, for whatever reason, is now deciding they're going to shut down any movement of anything on the Senate floor. So let me give one example, which is actually quite important. As you know, Mr. President, a lot of what we do here moves by what we call unanimous consent on the Senate floor. So there's rules to move things. They can take a lot of time, but a lot of time the leadership of the Senate will get together and say, okay, we can have a unanimous consent agreement to move things faster. And it's not just nominees. Sometimes it's actually legislation. As a matter of fact, a lot of things move on the Senate floor through unanimous consent. Essentially a voice vote where everybody, all 100 senators say, we agree with that. That's a bill that's really important, very bipartisan. Let's move it. Let's move it fast. It came out of committee. It's not controversial, but maybe it's important, so let's move it. Well, for whatever reason, still hasn't explained to the American people, the minority leader has said we're not going to move anything by unanimous consent right now either. So not only are we going to hold up every nominee as long as possible, even the non-controversial ones, nothing is going to move in the Senate by unanimous consent. Again, why? And how does that help the American people? How does that help the American people when you're just blocking things? Let me give you one specific example, an issue I feel very passionate about, Mr. President. I had a bill that was introduced last year, passed the Senate by unanimous consent, and we're trying to pass it right now by unanimous consent. This Congress, unfortunately, didn't pass out of the House. I think it will. It's passed out of committee again. It's called the Pro Bono Work to Empower and Represent Act, the POWER Act. Very bipartisan. A number of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, including Senator Heidkamp, Shaheen, Leahy, Warren, are co-sponsors. So here's what it does. You know, I come down the Senate floor every week talking about what a great state I live in, Alaska. Well, one thing that we actually aren't proud of in Alaska is we have a real big problem with domestic violence and sexual assault in my state. And one of the best ways to deal with that issue, one of the best ways to help victims and survivors break the cycle of violence that occurs with way too many families and way too many women and children in Alaska and across the country is to get them attorneys to represent them. Here's a startling fact. It's a little harsh when you say it, but it's true. If there's somebody who commits a rape or is accused of committing a rape, that person gets a Sixth Amendment right to counsel. Okay, that's our Bill of Rights. But guess what the victim gets in terms of legal representation? Nothing. There's no right. But that's a really important way to help break the cycle of violence, to get survivors and victims an attorney and get the resources to do that. Well, that's what the POWER Act does. And that's why it passed unanimous consent. Last year, we got a big problem in the country in terms of domestic violence and sexual assault. This would help. So guess what? We're trying to move it right now, unanimous consent. It'll pass. But it's not going to pass now because the minority leader's blocking every unanimous consent agreement on the Senate floor. Why? Why? Does he think that women in America don't need the resources to represent themselves in these kind of horrendous crimes? They do, trust me. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them do. So why are we blocking this? Why aren't we moving? We're shutting down the whole Senate, trying to shut down the federal government's ability to seat itself, do the work of the American people. Historic obstruction, and nobody explains it, and the press doesn't ask about it. And I think the American people need to know about it. We're elected to move this country forward. The election happened in November. Let's come together. Well, there's a lot of bipartisan work to do. Yeah, we have our differences on health care and other issues, but there are so many things where we don't have differences. Growing the economy, rebuilding our military, infrastructure. But you need people in the federal government who can do that. And you need leaders in the Senate who can help move things forward by unanimous consent, like the POWER Act, when they're not controversial. But we don't have those leaders right now. And we need them. And we need to get this country moving again. And the way things are happening on the Senate floor, it's not happening that way at all. Mr. President, I yield the floor.